Today we're looking at Mark 16, the final chapter in this eyewitness account of Jesus' life. And the whole gospel really hinges on what is said in this chapter, as well as the other accounts of what happened between the death and the resurrection of Jesus, where he died, was buried in a tomb, and then the story says that he was seen alive again. Because if the story ends at chapter 15, then the teaching that Jesus gave, the claims that he made about himself, the miracles that he performed, and the forgiveness that he claimed to offer for people, well, all of those all of a sudden come into question. And actually, you see that in the response of the disciples when Jesus dies. They are absolutely devastated at the news. The Christian faith itself hinges on these moments of his death and then coming back to life. Was he just a good teacher? Someone who we can follow as a good example of life, but who ultimately died the same way that you and I will? Or was he something else? Was he fully God as well as fully man, and death doesn't have the same power over him? So I guess as I come to consider my own questions about the resurrection, I wonder whether some of them might be similar to yours. And as we just explore and I share some thoughts of about these, I hope it helps you consider these, well, frankly, life-changing claims. Firstly, maybe Jesus wasn't dead at all. Maybe it just looked like he did, but he was never actually dead. Well, as you would have heard in Mark 15, actually, these guys, these soldiers, they killed thousands of people. They were experts in killing people, and killing people in a way that was so painful that actually a new word was invented. The word excruciating literally means out of the cross. These guys, they knew what they were doing, and also their own lives depended on it. They wouldn't risk letting someone get down from the cross if they weren't sure that they were dead. Okay, so you might say, so he was dead. But what about this claim about the tomb being empty? Well, probably makes sense that since it was such a public event, that people would have known, they would have been able to find out where that tomb was. So if there was some people going around saying, oh yeah, the tomb's empty, it's an empty tomb, actually, people could have gone there, gone to the place and said, no, actually, no, it's not. No, we've rolled the stone away. We can still see the body there. And also in terms of the witnesses. Now, at that time, the women were of a low rung on the social ladder, and actually their testimony was not treated in the same way as men's. And so when it was women who were the first witnesses of the empty tomb and the first witnesses of Jesus, actually, if you were going to make up the story, then in those times you wouldn't have chosen women to be those first witnesses for such a crucial part of the story. So that makes me think that actually, if they wouldn't have done that, they wouldn't have done that unless it was really actually what happened. So Jesus actually died. The tomb was empty, but what about the sightings? What about the sightings of Jesus that we hear? We hear there's a book later on in the Bible, 1 Corinthians, and in chapter 15, it talks about how Jesus appeared to more than 500 people at the same time. Alongside, we read about many other appearances to groups of people. This wasn't just one or two people. This was hundreds of people. I've heard people say, oh, is there any chance that they could have been hallucinating? Well, hallucinations they're normally just individual occurrences, things in the mind. It's not something that hundreds of people would experience the same hallucination at the same moment, and then in multiple moments seeing the same thing. Also, these people, when you look at them after Jesus died, they were devastated. They were in such despair. They weren't anticipating anything, which is probably more of a fertile ground for hallucinations. And also, so we're saying, well, okay, well, it's not hallucinations. if we go back to the previous point about, okay, did he actually, maybe he wasn't actually dead after all. If you think about it, like if he hadn't actually died and he'd somehow managed to escape from the tomb, his body would have been so battered and bruised from the beatings that he'd received even before going to the cross, that actually if the followers, the disciples, if they had seen him, it probably, this image, it probably wouldn't have been the most encouraging sight for them. These guys then go on to celebrate and speak about Jesus' victory over death. And if they had just seen this battered and bruised person who was just crawling around, really struggling, I'm not sure they would have, that really matches up with what they actually go on to say, that actually Jesus is someone who is victorious over death. The disciples themselves, I would say they're further evidence of what happened, in that I'm not sure they would have really gone to their deaths for something they weren't sure on or didn't really believe or they knew was made up. Whatever you think yourself, as you look at these disciples, you should be able to see that these guys were people who were absolutely convinced that they had seen Jesus alive again, that they had actually physically seen him. They were convinced that he had died. They were convinced the tomb was empty. They were convinced that they'd seen him alive again. There was no payoff from a human point of view. They were beaten, they were ridiculed, and many of them went to the most horrific of executions, the most horrific of deaths, just for what they believed in. And so I'm not sure that they would have really stood up for this if they weren't sure or if they knew it was made up. No, these guys were absolutely convinced that they had seen him alive again. And then we read about the message spreading. We read about that people continued to just choose to follow him. Even skeptics became convinced and joined their groups. And where at the time, if someone had looked at the Roman Empire and then this group of ordinary men and women and had asked, okay, well, in 2,000 years, out of these two groups, which one of them would still be around? Well, there's only going to be one winner. But we now look at it and we say, Jesus is still adding to his followers. He's still showing people that he's alive. By his Holy Spirit, he is here with us on earth and pointing us back to God the Father, the creator of all this, who wants to know you and wants to know me. And so as we come to the end of Mark, I hope you found it helpful to explore with us the eyewitness account of Jesus' life. You might still have questions. I want to tell you that is absolutely okay. We all do. But I do want to encourage you to think clearly about these questions. Did Jesus die? Was the tomb empty? And did people actually see him alive again? And if you would agree that the answer to those three questions is yes, then the follow-up question would be, okay, well, what does this mean for you today? Because Jesus is still adding to his followers even today. And maybe today is the day when you can respond to him.